Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and I had a subscriber ask a question, which is kind of something really similar to stuff I've touched on a lot lately, but I'm going to flip it in here. And he's basically asking, hey, is it okay to do higher rep isolation work, higher rep accessory work after lower rep, heavier compound movements, or are concerns with crossing over rep ranges in training really only talking about with the same exercises? So let me put on my +5 hat of weaponsmithing, do a little bit of crafting, and let's talk about this. All right, guys, when we start talking about things like this little minutia of training, micromanagement of training, I want people to understand that I'm not ever saying that because you do something different or because I'm advising against doing something that you can't make really good progress doing it that way. What we are talking about here is fine-tuning training for people who are trying to squeeze out that last couple percentages of either strength, muscle mass, whatever it is they are training for. That doesn't mean that doing the exact opposite can't still work. So something you've always got to make clear. You're not trying to be dogmatic here. We're simply talking about fine-tuning training. And again, for people who don't care about squeezing out every last gram of muscle on their body or trying to add every last ounce to a bar on a max lift, a lot of this stuff doesn't really apply because you can do totally different stuff and still make really good progress. So that, again, the difference, just like when we talk about training volume, and Brad Schoenfeld and others produce this data showing higher amounts of volume producing large amounts of muscle mass, or for maximizing muscle mass. In many cases, that doesn't mean someone can't come in and do one really productive work set and can't make a lot of muscle. They just won't make quite as much as they will, say, if they maximize their volume without surpassing their maximum recoverable fatigue. So you have to understand these points. This is not saying this is not a black or white topic, that it's one extreme or the other, the only good and bad, things like that. It doesn't work that way. You can't have that sort of thinking in this. So, mixing rep ranges when you're trying to maximize training frequency and doing concurrent style training is what we've been talking about with this. So you don't want to mix rep ranges in the same workout. Because again, it has to do with reducing your total tonnage you can lift when you do heavy reps versus the first, and then you do lighter reps later or higher reps later. It ends up reducing the amount of tension that you put on the muscle directly, so you don't get quite the strength and the neural efficiency that you would want from the heavier training, particularly like power training, because you went to the higher reps after, and then you impede your recovery. So what ends up happening is that oftentimes certain training will fatigue the peripheral nervous system more, and others will metabolically fatigue muscles more. And when you mix them in the same workout, you're having to have both systems recover at the same time. All right, and that can be problematic because it means you won't be able to train as frequently to keep muscle protein synthesis elevated, to train the motor pathways on an exercise or a body part even. So you're trying to avoid doing that. And generally with concurrent style training, when it's written by someone who is a real expert, a real strength and conditioning coach, even when we're talking about for bodybuilders or people who are chasing just size, this still applies. They are generally going to have your high reps and your low reps mixed into different days. Now in traditional periodization, you ran them into different blocks, completely different blocks of training, different weeks, sometimes 3 weeks apart. Whereas in more concurrent style training, and a lot of concurrent training and undulating periodization and things have become very, very popular again. They've kind of come into vogue again in the training world in the last few years. They're getting popular. And that's because, again, they're avoiding mixing the rep ranges. So when you're trying to maximize your training frequency while giving yourself proper recovery time, you generally want to do really heavy training on one day and then lighter training with higher reps on the other, so that, again, your peripheral nervous system is recovering more from the heavy training, and that won't affect your higher reps as much. Meaning while that's recovering and you're not retaxing it, you can come in and do metabolically fatiguing work by coming in and doing 5 sets of 12 reps or something, even on a big exercise, while your peripheral nervous system is recovering from doing those 3-rep deadlifts, those 3-rep or 5-rep squats and all of that stuff, without it interfering. In the same token, once you've done all that metabolic fatigue, your muscle tissue has to recover. It has metabolites and things it has to clear because you've created a large amount of metabolic fatigue. And again, all those metabolites released from that are very beneficial for muscle growth. There's a reason people do high volume training when they're seeking size. It's not even about just the tension on the muscle at a certain point. It is about these metabolites that are released and the responding cascade of hormones that follow behind. But when you're more metabolically fatigued, again, that has to recover. You can't replicate that same workload again until you've recovered from it and you've cleared those waste products and everything from the muscles. So by separating them, it allows you to train more frequently. All right, it allows you to train more frequently because these slightly different things going on in the body are recovering separately, and they're not negatively affecting each other's performance. Whereas when you mix the two, you have a longer recovery time. You have a longer recovery time before you're going to be able to train that lift or that muscle again to its fullest effect. So that's what we're talking about. That's why we're concerned about not mixing them. So when you look at it from that perspective, you would have the same problems if you come in and do 3 to 5 rep or 6 rep heavy compounds and then isolate some of the muscles in there with high reps. What's going to happen? Stop and think about that. You've already created the impact on the peripheral nervous system, all right? And you haven't maximized that effect because you're coming in and doing fluff behind it. That is time you could have spent just lifting more heavy weight to capitalize and get the most training volume possible for what you're training in that one session, all right? And if you do that, again, you're only going to be worried about that one system recovering. It is being what's going to hold you back from training. But when you come in and do the real high rep isolation work behind it, you're creating metabolic fatigue in some of the same muscles. So when you come in and try to train them again too soon, they're not going to have been properly recovered, those individual muscles, due to the metabolic workload. So yeah, it's going to force you to spread your training back out, which isn't going to be ideal for pursuing maximum progress. All right, it's going to be non-ideal. Now, that being said, does that mean that you can't do that and still make good gains? Of course you can. Many people have over the years. But again, if someone is doing more complex periodization like we're talking about with concurrent training, they're trying to chase that 1%, that last elusive 1 to 2% progress. That's why these sort of systems are developed. For people who aren't chasing that in a competitive environment, it probably is. It just isn't that big of a deal. All right, it isn't that big of a deal. So for most of you out there lifting, you're not trying to compete in anything. You're not trying to push anything to its absolute maximum extreme. If you just feel like doing some high rep isolation work for a weak body part after you lift heavy, that's fine. Because you're probably not trying to maximize your training. You're probably only in the gym 3 days a week lifting, like most people should be. For most people, that's going to be ideal. Not that big of a deal. You start trying to go to 4 days or more, that's when this stuff starts to become really important. If you're training 3 days a week, it really probably isn't going to be a problem. Because again, you've got 48 hours at least between every single training session, pretty much year round. It's not that big of a deal. It's training sessions where this really becomes a problem when you have training days that are within 24 hours of each other again the next day. But as far as that goes, for people who are doing concurrent style training like that, who have, what they're calling, they always like to call it power hypertrophy days, power days and hypertrophy days. I think the better term would be tension versus fatigue days, because you're dealing with mechanical tension, weight on the bar, versus metabolic fatigue, which is fatiguing the muscles through workload. It would really be a more appropriate term because both of these things can build power, both of these things can create hypertrophy. So the other is just a little bit better of a term. But if you're doing it that way, you probably don't want to do high rep isolation work on your big heavy days. You come in and do your big heavy compounds for your maximum recoverable volume for sets, and you're done with it. You don't need to come in and do a bunch of high rep isolation work. I would recommend against it on that type of training system. You save that for your volume days, your metabolic fatigue days. And if you do it that way, you're going to be able to maximize your progress a little more. And most of those programs are going to be written with that understanding and with those goals in mind. So that's the way you have to look at it. And usually, again, you go look at the way these are written by someone who really does know what they're doing, a good coach, you're probably not going to see very much high rep isolation work recommended on the heavy days. Just for that reason. They're generally going to be split up. And it's perfectly fine to split them up. You don't have to come in and isolate every weak body part every time you train with a bunch of high rep work. It's just not necessary. Although it probably is essential to make sure you're doing it at some point in the week. Clearly, if you've got a lagging body part, you probably need to be doing high rep isolation work for it. At least it's somewhere within the week if you really want to bring it up. But it doesn't have to be every time you train. And certainly not at the expense of creating fatigue that's going to negatively impact your next workout, if that muscle is going to be involved in any way in your next workout. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.